Today, my dear viewers, I would like to tell you about an interesting anecdote about cannibalism in Al-Andalus and the use of historical sources and criticism thereof. And I hope you will find it interesting. The conquests of Egypt and North Africa and the Al-Andalus. فتوح مصر والمغرب والأندلس by Abul-Qasim Abdalh'akam ibn Abdalh'akam is one of the earliest complete Islamic Arabic histories to have survived to the present day. It is one of the most contemporary accounts that describe in detail the initial invasion and takeover of the Iberian Peninsula that led to the creation of Al-Andalus, the Muslim-dominated parts of the Iberian Peninsula. Though this account is still written a century and a half after the events it describes. But what it describes is an island on the coast of the Iberian Peninsula that was taken over as a part of the invasion and as a part of the full-scale invasion and takeover of the mainland. And it is on this island where these events that I am about to describe took place, according to Ibn Abdalh'akam. When the Muslims settled in the island, they found no other inhabitants there than wine dressers. They made them prisoners. After that, they took one of the wine dressers, slaughtered him, cut him in pieces, and boiled him, while the rest of his companions looked on. They had also boiled meat in other cauldrons. When the meat was cooked, they threw away the flesh of that man which they had boiled, no one knowing that it was thrown away, and they ate the meat which they had boiled, while the rest of the wine dressers were spectators. These did not doubt but that the Muslims ate the flesh of their companion. The rest, being afterwards sent away, informed the people of Andalus that the Muslims fed on human flesh, equating them with what had been done to the wine dresser. If taken at face value, this is an anecdote about pretend cannibalism, pretending to do this extreme action towards enemies to make them believe that you are capable and willing to do these extreme actions. A terror tactic. By killing a man and then pretending to do cannibalism, it instills fear and makes people spread these rumors about you, making people fear you, which can be useful on the battlefield, as it will make people more prone to run rather than to face you as an enemy and risk these terrible fates that are described in these rumors that you are cultivating. By cultivating these rumors, you could also threaten to do these acts by lying in order to make people give up and surrender if you promise to not do them if they surrender. Because even if cannibalism is extremely against Islamic law and what is appropriate action according to Islam, this does not mean that your enemies knew this. And the people on the Iberian Peninsula most certainly did not know this, especially this early, as Islam as a religion had only been around for decades as a new religion, not even a century. And the religion also started on the faraway Arabian Peninsula, and you are currently on the Iberian Peninsula, fighting against people during the early medieval period, where people are not that open to new religious thinking and new religious ideas, and rather believe that their own local religion is the absolute truth, in this case being Roman Christianity. So it is not probable that anyone on the Iberian Peninsula among your enemies knew what Islam actually entailed. So you could get away with using these terror tactics as a way to spread fear in those that did not know anything about you. So there certainly are valid reasons to have tried this tactic, as it makes sense logically to have tried this. But there are some issues with Ibn Abdalh'akam as a source, and about this anecdote in particular. Firstly is the fact that many historians are critical of Ibn Abdalhakam's work as a source due to various source issues associated with it. And this general view of Ibn Abdalh'akam can be said to be summarized by the translator and historian Charles Torrey from the beginning of the last century. but his criticism is also shared by later historians as well. Our author cannot be accorded high rank as a historian, however. Both in the choice of his material and in the use of it, he shows again and again how lightly he took his task and how little is to be expected from him in the way of critical judgment. Him and later historians have generally been critical of many of the stories found in Ibn Abdalhakam's work, and they have been critical of how he mixes fact and often quite clearly fictional narratives in his works. Though in Ibn Abdalhakam's defense, there are a lot of other older sources that do this as well, and they are not nearly as criticized as Ibn Abdalhakam has been, and are still utilized as sources for history. Actually, most of the classical Greek histories are like that, in how they mix fact with fiction in order to create historical narratives, and just accept the most outrageous of claims in order to create a good story. And also, I don't really agree 100% with the claim that he lacks critical judgment, as we can actually see how Ibn Abdalhakam treats sources of varying reliability. For example, in this passage, he returned, leaving to Tariq ibn Amru the command of his army, which amounted to 1,700. Others say that 12,000 Berbers, besides 16 Arabs, were with Tariq, but that is false. It is also said that Musa ibn Usayr marched out of Ifriqiya upon an expedition into Tangiers. So Ibn Abdalhakam actually did do criticism of various claims by accepting or rejecting certain claims. And here I also go into one of the issues I think that a lot of people also have with how he recognizes a claim as being stronger or weaker than another. And that is that he organizes his history according to fiqh and hadith traditions and principles, rather than as a more regular chronicler, like for example Tabari and other Arabic writers. For example, for most of his stories, he gives chains of accounts, chains of narrators, chains of narrations, just like you do for an hadith or a similar story in a religious jurisprudence context within Islamic fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence. And this ought not be that surprising, as Ibn Abdalhakam was an Islamic jurist within the Mālikī school of Islamic jurisprudence, and a rather prominent Islamic jurist within that school, in fact. Furthermore, I would even argue that it is an advantage that he gives accounts about from where these stories are coming from, as this attribution is actually a strength. But the issue arises in that he accepts these stories, not based upon if the stories themselves are plausible or likely to have happened in themselves, but upon who said it and to whom. Just like you do with hadiths, the stories about Muhammad and his closest companions, where you argue from the chain of narrations if it is a strong or a weak hadith, making it so that you get stories and narratives that are contradictory and or disconnected from each other, and you get stories that are so fantastical and so implausible or even impossible to have happened that the stories themselves are very doubtful to have happened, or even outright not possible to have happened like that. And sometimes it can be hard to separate fiction from reality among these stories too. And Ibn Abdalhakam's work shares these issues with hadiths, as he has written his history like a hadith collection, like a collection of hadith stories, but related to later history, rather than the history about Muhammad and his closest companions. With that said, Christopher James Wright thinks that the work is still useful for Egyptian Arab history. And though his work about Ibn Abdalhakam and his work focuses on Egyptian Arab history and describes various tendencies in the work towards various political factions during a period of conflict between the newly arrived Mamluk Turks and the older Arab aristocracy there, where Ibn Abdalh'akam clearly has his biases, it still works as a good source, with some considerations. And personally, I think that the biases that Ibn Abdalh'akam has in regard to Egyptian history have less of an influence upon his descriptions regarding Al-Andalus. Yet, it can also be said that things are possibly more spiced up due to the foreign location, and pretend cannibalism could be a fun anecdote that he included due to the fact that it would spice up the history that he is presenting here. And Ibn Abdalh'akam does have a general tendency to have selected for stories that are more out there rather than them being plausible or likely to have happened. As long as a chain of narrators could be established to a story, he would include it, despite it being of a rather fantastical nature. And you can actually question if this actually happened like this, or if it was only included due to the fact that Ibn Abdalh'akam thought it was an interesting story to include, despite other historians probably not including it. Though it should be said that generally the other narratives about the conquest of Al-Andalus are not that out there. And parts of these narratives can be true where other parts might not be. And I have actually used Ibn Abdalh'akam as a source for history at several occasions, but it is very much on a case-by-case basis if I think he is trustable or not in a certain particular issue. But what makes me doubtful about this particular story, besides the peculiarity of the subject matter of this anecdote, as well as it being in a work that contains a lot of other stories that are clearly not true and are fictional, is the fact that it contains a rhetorical device that points towards it being a fictional creation rather than a recounting of true history. And this device is that the people that are taken prisoners are wine dressers, persons who cultivate and prune grapevines in order to make wine. As wine and alcohol generally is forbidden in Islam, it becomes less bad to kill and cut up and boil a wine dresser and to terrify the other wine dressers that are there as these helpless civilians than it would otherwise be. And this is part of a greater truth or theme or even cliché in fiction, and in this case Arabic fictional literature from this age, about it being okay to do bad things towards people that do various sinful actions as part of their professions, or have shameful professions, such as prostitutes, blacksmiths, or in this case, wine dressers. And it is a bit too convenient that all the helpless civilians on the island are wine dressers. The brutality of these acts, the killing of the wine dresser, the cutting up of his body, and the throwing of his cut up body into the cauldron, thus desecrating his body, are not out of bounds from what we knew about how medieval armies could act in the Islamic world and elsewhere. And there are both Arabic and non-Arabic sources that depict and describe far worse violence and brutality than this in regards to the conquest of the Iberian Peninsula. But it is the fact that the only victims in this story are vine dressers, which you can easily sacrifice in a narrative sense, and there ought to exist other professions on an island too, which makes me suspect that this story might have been fabricated, or at the very least the part about all the inhabitants of the island being wine dressers is probably fabricated, which still casts doubt upon the rest of the story, especially when you consider this in light of the fact that Ibn Abdalhakam's work also contains other stories that are a lot more clearly not true due to their impossibility or improbability, combined with the fact that the subject matter of this story, pretend cannibalism, was probably chosen more for its attention-grabbing nature than it was for the fact that it was a true story. And thus it is quite possible and even likely that this story is fabricated either by Ibn Abdalh'akam himself or by one of the sources or narrators that he used in order to make his work. This story can be doubted because it sounds so extreme in combination with the source having various questionable qualities to it that makes it into an unreliable source at times. But the events described in this story could have possibly happened, as they are not supernatural, they are not against the laws of logic, and there are reasonable reasons as to why you would actually do these acts. To spread fear in the ranks of your enemies. So it is doubtful that it happened like it is described in this story, but it is still possible that it happened. And in any case, I still find it an interesting story, with interesting considerations regarding source criticism and how you can value or not value a source depending upon various factors and considerations. And that was this story about cannibalism, or rather pretend cannibalism, in Al-Andalus. And I hope you found this video interesting. Please do post comments and questions in the comment section, and I will try to respond to you as quickly as possible. Please do subscribe, as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities.
اشتركوا بالقناة من فضلكم.